Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Teezo Touchdown record, How Do You Sleep at Night? Teezo on Twitter requested that anyone that reviewed this record to wear pajamas while they did it, and this is what I wear in all of my reviews, but also it's what I sleep in, so do with that information what you will. Take it as Infinite Jukebox lore, I guess. Teezo Touchdown has had a very interesting rise to mainstream popularity, considering a lot of it has been entirely based around his work as a features artist. I mean, don't get me wrong, there have been plenty of artists throughout the course of music history that have been shot into relevancy because of features. Everyone from Snoop Dogg to T-Pain has really seen that sort of career trajectory. That being said, there's usually a little bit more to really build up the hype, maybe some really huge singles that come out before an artist's debut, or something along those lines, maybe a controversy of some sort. And none of that really happened for Teezo, but he's still massive. And you know, it's kind of understandable considering what kind of albums you realize the guy's been featured on over the course of the past couple of years. I mean, he's got a clean track record in the public eye, and he hasn't had any chart-topping songs or anything like that, but he was also featured on Tyler, the Creator's Call Me If You Get Lost, and perhaps most notably, as well as most recently, Travis Scott's very long-awaited Utopia. It's not hard to see why so many people are anticipating a debut from this guy. Some of the biggest, most popular, most relevant records of the past few years have had one or two Teezo Touchdown features on them, so I guess the popularity does make sense in the end. That being said, as someone who's been following Teezo and his music for some time at this point, I've always felt like these features poorly represented him as an artist. Not necessarily that the features were bad, they're some of the best work he's ever put out, actually, but that they weren't really reflective of his sound, or his lack thereof. You see, he doesn't really have a singular style. I mean, if you go through the man's singles discography up to this point, you have everything from cutesy bedroom pop to a lot of work that's based around snotty pop rock, pop punk kind of sounds. You even have some more experimental hip hop being thrown in there, and it makes for a listening experience that's a bit confusing. Now, with all of that in mind, that is all of the context that you need for How Do You Sleep at Night, an album that I think I speak for behalf of a lot of people when I say that it is probably the most polarizing album I've heard this year so far. Not only publicly, because it is polarizing on a large scale level, but also because, man, I've listened to this a lot of times and I do not know how to feel about it still. Upon first glance, How Do You Sleep at Night appears to be just an absolute disaster of a record. I mean, the snippets released by Teezo himself on Twitter leading up to the record were questionable at best and not necessarily the best representation of the record as a whole. That isn't to mention that the sort of stomp clap, chorus-based album opener Okay is the only genuinely bad song on the entire album, meaning that things do not open up with a great, promising start. It just doesn't seem like it's going to be a good album upon first glance. In fact, I was expecting to either A, not review this, or B, give it a quick review for the sake of just getting my negativity out there and not really waste my time doing a, say, 15-minute review on this record. But there's much more to it, but I'll get to that in a minute. I mean, even the best songs on the track list here have these odd stylistic choices. A lot of the very squeaky, clean pop rock throughout How Do You Sleep at Night is so polished to an almost cartoonish extent that I can kind of understand why it would drive a lot of people away, especially for those looking for something maybe a bit more aggressive, a bit more hard, a bit more raw. Those are things that this album is not. Really, in comparison to the records that Teezo has been featured on over the past couple of years, this is a highly experimental album, or at least a very, very different one. So for people who discovered him via features on albums like the aforementioned Utopia, I can kind of understand where any, say, apprehensions, we'll say, may lie. And I can make similar comments about a lot of different songs on this record. The pop, synthy, funk vibes of songs like Nune and Mood Swings, or the general laid-back, chill R&B kind of tone that's taken up on a lot of different moments and passages throughout this record. It just means that it's an absolute mess of a listening experience, and normally that is a massive criticism that I constantly have against a lot of albums that I cover on this channel. I mean, look, all I'm saying is that, logically, from an entire logic-based standpoint, this album should be horrible, but it's not. I don't know how to feel about that. Because the strangest part about it all is that it just works perfectly. I'm not saying the album is perfect. This album is far from perfect, but at the same time, the concepts that are being delivered here each individually work out really well, and at this point, after multiple listens, I think I can really just boil it down to Teezo being a deeply earnest performer. He is just such a likable presence on this record, and honestly, I think that he is the one that sells it above all else. I will say that due to the fact that there are a variety of tones being taken up on this record, that there's just a serious lack of fluidity throughout. I'm not saying that an album's inherently bad because it plays with a number of different genres. I just think that an album like this should maybe try a little bit harder to really blend from track to track half decently. It ultimately takes away from the emotional weight of songs like I Don't Think You See Me, which should be a lot more powerful and striking than they ultimately are, even if they are just fine in the context of this track list. But on a better album, they would be downright excellent. Nonetheless, a lot of the album is actually pretty impressive. You have the very nice Janelle Monáe collaboration, You Thought, a deeply emotional track, or the commentary-esque sort of song, Neighborhood, which discusses poverty and economic oppression, among other things, and all of it just feels so weirdly genuine, which is not something I was expecting from this record at all. And you know what, there are a lot of times where Teezo comes across as simplistic, even too simplistic for his own good at times, even if it's something relating to himself and his own personal feelings and experiences. But in the same way, that dorky simplicity and that heartfelt delivery is kind of what defines the personality of the album. It's poorly executed, but at the same time, it's perfectly executed because that's how it needs to be executed. I feel like I'm going insane. Despite many claims from myself as well as other listeners that Teezo Touchdown's debut album can be too synthetic for its own good, something that I do absolutely stand by, this isn't a completely unlikable album. It's downright really charming in a lot of places. And ultimately, just the cleanliness of it combines with the genuineness of Teezo's delivery and his songwriting, and the sort of intentional or maybe not intentional amateurishness of some of the lyricism here, to make for something that's just peculiar. I can't even say it's good because I don't necessarily feel that it's good or great, but it's certainly not bad either, and it's not mediocre. It's in this weird gray area between and okay. You know, it's such a deeply confusing album to me. Okay, all of that aside, I do not think that How Do You Sleep at Night should be exclusively talked about in a positive light. There are a lot of deeply rooted flaws here that make it, again, far from a perfect album. As I stated, the lyricism here can come across as a bit amateurish at times, definitely hit or miss by definition. I do feel that a lot of it is intentional, but that doesn't necessarily equate to being good. There are a lot of tracks here that I wish were written maybe just in a bit more of a fleshed out manner, or maybe in a more narrative-based direction. I really don't know how I would fix this album's lyrical content per se, but at the same time, some of it just does not work. And the weirdest part is, there are some songs here that actually have great songwriting. I mean, Stranger is a really emotional piece that sees Teezo seriously just pouring his love out for another individual, and the track Sweet Love also does the same thing roundabout. I mean, it's in a different manner, but nonetheless, it's still a really impressive take on just romance as a topic. It feels modern, it feels fresh, it feels well executed. I can't really say anything bad about it. And you know what? I even think that Teezo's very charming personality and presence is powerful enough to let some cringeworthy lyrics slide here or there. I mean, you know, they kind of suit him in a way. However, there's also lyrics throughout this album that just don't quite make the cut in that particular direction. I mean, you have the, again, aforementioned Teezo Janelle Monáe collab, You Thought, where he says, "You would have thought we were in Aspen, how cold your ass been?" If anyone other than Teezo Touchdown said that in a song, that would be an immediate half a star out of 5. I'm sorry, that's just, it's so clunky no matter how it's delivered. I genuinely do think that a lot of the legs of this record are based around Teezo's just personality behind the mic, because ultimately there are lyrics like that sprinkled throughout this record, not constantly, but at a fairly moderate rate, that are only a step or two or away from Eminem, "That booty's heavy duty like diarrhea." It's not necessarily good, and genuinely, if anybody else wrote these lyrics, I would be much harsher for some reason, but you know, Teezo kind of makes it work, even in the worst moments of the record. The lack of singular creative direction is also kind of an issue throughout How Do You Sleep at Night. I mean, I do really admire what Teezo was doing here. He takes a lot of massive creative steps to ensure that there's a versatile listening experience to keep the listener engaged throughout the entire record, but the album isn't all that long, meaning that it doesn't really need to constantly be changing at all times in chameleon fashion to keep you engaged. It's not a 3-hour quadruple album or anything like that. And B, ultimately, it changes so much that very little of it feels like it's rightfully connected together. I mean, really, there are just some jumps between influences here from song to song that are just a bit too drastic, even by Teezo Touchdown standards. I mean, for example, you have the punkish energy of a song like Too Easy that's ready to really fill a stadium with chants. It doesn't exactly fit next to a power popish cutesy kind of song like Familiarity, yet there they remain, right next to each other on the exact same album, and it doesn't really work. Look, I will be completely 100% honest here. How Do You Sleep at Night is an absolute disastrous mess of a record, and it's one that works way more often than it should. All of the necessary qualities for a weak pop, rock, R&B fusion record are found right here on this album. And yet, at the same time, Teezo Touchdown manages to tie everything together and make it work at a pretty consistent rate. I mean, the album still has a lot of major flaws, of course, but at the same time, it's not an outright bad album, and it's very strange. I was expecting to go into this album just not enjoying it whatsoever, and I decided that I was probably just going to do a quick review of it to talk about why it's bad, and then just move on with my life. And now here I am, talking about the album that has probably confused me the most throughout the entirety of 2023, and that's saying something, because I've listened to a lot of weird music this year, but somehow this is probably the weirdest just conceptually. Look, I will say this. How Do You Sleep at Night? It's absolutely confusing, but it makes sense. And you know what? An album this oxymoronic in nature hasn't hit the mainstream in quite some time, so you know what? It's good to see, I think. Dude, I don't think there's like a proper rating for me to give this. I'm going to give this record Teezo stars out of 5. Yep. And with that being said, that is the end of this extremely confusing album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.